Good evening, everyone, and welcome back. I'm really glad you're here tonight. Wherever you may be listening from, whether the room around you is already warm or whether the night air is beginning to creep in through the cracks, because tonight we're stepping into a place where warmth was never guaranteed, a place where surviving winter was a quiet daily struggle, rather than a comfort taken for granted. So before we begin, feel free to dim the lights, settle in, and let your breathing slow. And if you enjoy these calm historical journeys, you're always welcome to stay and listen again another night. Tonight, we're walking through the heavy oak doors of a medieval castle during one of the coldest winters anyone can remember. A winter so harsh that even the stones seem to hold their breath, and as the door closes behind you with a deep wooden thud, the air inside feels immediately different, sharper, older, almost alive, as if centuries of cold have been patiently waiting for someone to return. The first thing you notice is not the grandeur, not the banners or the vaulted ceilings, but the temperature itself, a slow creeping presence that slides along the floor and settles into your bones, making your fingers ache before the hour has even passed. Because these walls, for all their strength and power, were never built to keep people warm, only to keep enemies out. As you walk deeper into the castle, your boots echo softly across the flagstones of the great hall, each step sounding louder than it should in the vast space, while torches hiss and sputter in narrow brackets along the walls, their flames flickering nervously in the drafts that sneak through every crack and doorway. And even here, in the heart of the castle, you can feel the cold breathing gently against the back of your neck. The stone walls rise around you, immense and unforgiving, blocks of granite and limestone stacked thick enough to stop arrows and siege engines, yet so dense that they seem to exhale cold into the room, absorbing any warmth the fire dares to give, and holding on to the chill like a memory that refuses to fade. And it's easy to understand why historians believe that during deep winter, temperatures inside many castles dropped close to freezing, sometimes even below it. You imagine waking before dawn in a narrow bed tucked against one of these walls, your breath visible in the dim light, frost clinging to the inside of your window coverings, and water in a jug beside you stiffened into ice, and you realize that in a medieval castle, staying warm was never a passive thing. It was an active, constant effort that shaped every hour of the day. In the great hall, a fire burns in a hearth large enough to roast an ox, its flames roaring and popping as servants feed it with carefully rationed wood. Yet even this mighty blaze struggles to warm the far corners of the room, and you could stand close enough to feel your cheeks flush while still sensing a thin ribbon of cold sliding down your spine, a reminder that the castle always wins this quiet battle. Castles were designed for defense, not comfort, and their very features worked against warmth, with narrow arrow slits that invited drafts, towering ceilings that allowed heat to rise and vanish into darkness, and vast open spaces that echoed with sound but refused to hold warmth, turning winter nights into long tests of endurance. To survive, people relied on layers rather than structures. Layers of wool and linen, layers of fur and leather, layers of people gathered close together around the fire, because warmth in a medieval castle was as much social as it was physical, and isolation meant cold in more ways than one. Tapestries hung thick along the walls, not only as decoration but as primitive insulation, their woven scenes of hunts and battles trapping thin pockets of air between fabric and stone, dulling the worst of the chill, while rushes and straw were scattered across the floors to soften the bite of the frozen flagstones beneath tired feet. Even so, the cold was relentless, and chroniclers from the north of England, Scotland, and the Alpine regions wrote of winters so severe that wine turned to slush in goblets and ink froze before it could dry. And whether exaggerated or not, these stories reveal something essential, that life inside a castle during winter was never easy, no matter how high your status or how thick the walls around you. Yet despite the discomfort, there was a strange beauty to these moments, because as night fell and the firelight painted faces in gold and shadow, people gathered not just to survive but to share warmth, stories, and silence. And in those flickering hours, the cold walls faded slightly into the background, replaced by the simple human need to stay close and endure together. And as the wind howls outside along the battlements, rattling shutters and whispering through narrow slits in the stone, you sit near the fire, listening to the crackle of wood and the soft murmur of voices, beginning to understand that in a medieval castle, warmth was never just about fire. It was about people, patience, and the quiet determination to face another frozen night. As the fire settles into a steady rhythm and the night deepens beyond the walls, your attention drifts from the great hall toward the private spaces of the castle, places where the battle against cold became more intimate and more personal, because when the crowds dispersed and the servants withdrew, every man, woman, and child still had to face the long hours of darkness wrapped in stone. Sleeping in a medieval castle was nothing like the quiet comfort we imagine today, because even the most privileged chambers were exposed to draughts that slid beneath doors and crept through arrow slits, and beds were positioned not for beauty but for survival, pulled away from outer walls whenever possible, angled to avoid the worst currents of air that whispered constantly through the room. The bed itself was a fortress of fabric, raised high on a wooden frame, not for elegance, but to escape the cold that pooled along the floor, layered with straw mattresses, woolen pads, and heavy linens, then buried beneath thick blankets and animal furs, whose scent lingered faintly in the air, a mixture of smoke, lanolin, and age, and once inside this cocoon, the body's own warmth became the most valuable resource of all. In many castles, entire families slept together, not out of sentiment but necessity, because shared heat mattered, and servants might sleep at the foot of the bed or on pallets nearby, while children were tucked between adults like living embers, and even dogs were welcomed into these crowded sleeping spaces, curling tightly against legs and backs, their steady breathing and warm bodies offering a comfort more reliable than any stone wall. Contemporary records quietly confirm this practice, with household accounts noting food allowances for dogs kept indoors during winter months, not as pets in the modern sense, but as practical companions against the cold. And when you imagine the scene now, a dim chamber lit by a single candle, bodies wrapped close together beneath layers of fabric, the sound of wind muffled slightly by walls and tapestries, it feels less like hardship and more like a fragile island of warmth carved out of a frozen world. For those of higher status, an additional defense against the cold came in the form of braziers, shallow metal bowls filled with glowing coals, placed carefully near the bed or beneath tables, their heat radiating softly upward. But these came with risks, because charcoal fumes were dangerous in enclosed spaces, and servants were tasked with watching them closely, stirring the embers, replacing coals, and ensuring the Lord's toes did not freeze before morning arrived. Even clothing became part of the nightly ritual, as people often slept wearing layers they would normally remove, linen shifts beneath woolen garments, caps pulled low over ears, socks wrapped in additional cloth, because in a castle, removing warmth too quickly could mean shivering until dawn, and no one wanted to wake already exhausted by the cold. The walls themselves were sometimes softened with wooden paneling, a subtle innovation that made a noticeable difference, because wood held air and warmth far better than stone, and when your hand brushes across one of these panels now, you can feel that it is faintly warmer, smoother, almost human compared to the lifeless chill beside it. And it's easy to imagine the quiet relief this small improvement brought during the darkest months. Yet, no matter how many layers were added, the castle never truly slept. Because wood beams creaked as temperatures dropped, stone contracted and sighed, and somewhere water dripped steadily where condensation formed and slid down ancient walls, creating a soft, repetitive sound that marked the passing of hours. And in that rhythm people learned to rest even when comfort was incomplete. The cold shaped routines as well as architecture, encouraging early nights and slow mornings, as fires had to be rebuilt from embers before any real warmth returned, and servants moved quietly through halls still wrapped in shadow, breath fogging the air as they coaxed flames back to life, knowing that the entire household depended on their success. Outside, the castle grounds lay silent beneath frost and snow, courtyards transformed into wind tunnels that funneled icy gusts between towers, while banners snapped sharply against stone, and ravens hunched on parapets with feathers puffed against the cold, enduring the same night in their own way, watched over by walls that protected life even as they drained its warmth. And within those walls, people adapted, not with technology or comfort, but with patience, shared space, and an understanding that warmth was fleeting and precious, something to be guarded through the night until the faintest hint of dawn slipped through the narrow slits in the stone, promising another day of fire, effort, and endurance. Morning in a medieval castle never arrived with warmth, only with a pale grey light that slipped reluctantly through narrow openings in the stone, revealing breath still hanging in the air and shadows that seemed unwilling to retreat. And as people stirred from sleep, the cold was already waiting, settled into floors, walls, and wooden beams, like a patient presence that had never truly left during the night. The first task of the day was always the fire, because without it the castle remained a frozen shell, and servants moved carefully through the dim halls carrying kindling and embers preserved from the night before, shielding them from draughts with cupped hands and cloaks, knowing that if those coals died, the entire household would spend hours shivering while new flames struggled to take hold. Lighting a fire in winter was not a simple act, but a practiced skill, as damp wood smoked more than it burned and every spark mattered. And once the hearth finally came alive, people gathered close, extending stiff fingers toward the heat, rubbing hands together slowly, as feeling returned in painful waves, because warmth came back gradually, never all at once. The kitchens were the first places to truly warm, ovens roaring from before sunrise, as bread was baked and stews were set to simmer, and these rooms became accidental sanctuaries against the cold, crowded with servants who lingered longer than necessary, drawn not just by duty, but by the simple relief of standing near a source of constant heat. In contrast, the rest of the castle lagged behind, corridors remaining cold long after breakfast, stairwells acting like chimneys that carried warm air upward and out of reach, and private chambers only slowly losing the frost that had formed overnight on window coverings and walls, reminding everyone that comfort was temporary and required constant effort to maintain. Clothing was chosen with care each morning, layers added thoughtfully rather than removed, wool closest to the skin despite its roughness, linen beneath to absorb moisture, cloaks worn even indoors, and hats rarely taken off, because in a medieval castle, heat lost through the head or hands was noticed immediately, and punished by aching joints and numbing fingers. Even movement was shaped by cold, encouraging slower steps and careful planning, because wandering aimlessly through draught-filled corridors meant losing precious warmth, and people learned to cluster their tasks around hearths, ovens, and sunlit corners whenever possible, structuring daily life around islands of heat scattered through a sea of stone. As the day progressed, sunlight briefly softened the cold where it touched walls and floors, but its reach was limited, blocked by thick masonry and narrow windows designed to defend rather than illuminate, and by afternoon the warmth it offered faded again, leaving the castle once more in the grip of winter's quiet persistence. Despite this, life continued, shaped by routine and resilience rather than comfort, with meals eaten near fires, conversations held in close circles, and work paced carefully to conserve energy. And in this way, people learned not to fight the cold directly, but to live alongside it, acknowledging its presence without surrendering to it. By evening, preparations for night began early, fires built higher, braziers filled, beds arranged carefully away from outer walls, and families gathered once more into shared spaces, drawn together by necessity as much as by habit, because night in a medieval castle was long, and warmth was something best faced together. Outside, the wind returned with renewed strength, sliding along battlements and rattling shutters, pressing against stone that had already given everything it could, while inside, the soft crackle of firewood and the murmur of voices, created a fragile boundary between survival and surrender, a thin line of human warmth held against the vast cold beyond. And as darkness settled fully over the castle, the rhythms of winter repeated themselves once more, embers glowing softly beneath ash, bodies wrapped in fabric and fur, breath rising and falling in unison, and somewhere within those ancient walls, the quiet determination to endure another frozen night remained steady, unspoken and shared. As night settles once more over the castle and the world beyond the walls disappears beneath darkness and frost, you begin to notice how the cold reshapes not only space, but behavior, turning every small decision into a calculation about warmth, distance and endurance, because in a medieval winter, even moving from one room to another carried a cost. The higher you climb within the castle, the colder it becomes, and the towers that look so majestic from the outside are often the most miserable places to inhabit in winter, exposed on all sides to wind that circles endlessly, slipping through narrow stairwells and unsealed joints in the stone, making these lofty chambers suitable for storage, guards or prisoners, but rarely for comfortable living. Guards stationed in these towers wrap themselves in heavy cloaks and paced constantly to keep blood moving through their legs, stamping their feet softly against the stone to chase away numbness, and even then their breath fogged the air, their fingers stiff around spear shafts, because standing still meant surrendering heat to the walls. Lower down, deeper within the castle's core, conditions improved slightly, not because the walls were thinner, but because the surrounding mass of stone and earth acted as a buffer against the worst of the wind, and here, in interior chambers, people clustered during the coldest hours, preferring rooms with fewer exterior walls and doors that could be sealed tightly with cloth or leather. Some castles took advantage of this natural layering, assigning winter living spaces deliberately, with noble families retreating inward during the cold months, leaving outer rooms and upper levels largely abandoned until spring. And when you walk through these spaces now in your mind, you can almost feel the difference. A subtle stillness in the air where the wind no longer whispers quite so loudly. The role of smoke in these castles was strangely double-edged, uncomfortable yet useful, because while it stung the eyes and darkened ceilings, it also lingered beneath the rafters, forming a hazy layer that trapped warmth below. And in halls without proper chimneys, this smoky ceiling may have acted as a crude but effective barrier against heat loss, lowering just enough to make life bearable during the worst nights. People learned to live beneath this veil of smoke, eyes watering slightly, hair and clothing absorbing the scent of burning wood, and over time, tolerance replaced discomfort, because the alternative was colder air and longer suffering, and so smoke became part of the sensory landscape of winter, as familiar as the crackle of fire or the groan of settling beams. Wealth made a difference, but not as much as one might expect, because while noble households could afford more fuel, thicker tapestries and additional servants to tend fires through the night, even the richest lord could not command stone to hold heat, and so privilege softened winter's edge without ever fully removing it. In contrast, poorer residents and servants often slept closer to kitchens or bakeries, curling up on pallets near ovens that radiated residual warmth long after cooking had finished. And these spaces, crowded and noisy by day, became the most desirable shelters by night, places where bodies, breath, and brick combined to create a fragile warmth that lasted until morning. The rhythm of winter days shortened life itself, encouraging earlier meals, longer nights, and a slower pace that conserved energy, because cold drained strength invisibly, and exhaustion made people vulnerable, not just to illness but to despair, and so routines became anchors, predictable sequences that offered comfort when physical warmth was scarce. Faith also played its part, as chapels within the castle became gathering points not only for prayer but for shared presence, candles flickering in rows, their small flames adding just enough heat to take the edge off the cold, while voices murmured together in the dim space, filling it with sound and purpose that reached deeper than any fire. As the hours pass and the fire sinks once again toward embers, You sense how survival here depended less on defeating the cold and more on accommodating it, accepting its presence while refusing to let it define the human spirit. And in that quiet balance between endurance and hope, the medieval castle reveals its true nature, not as a place of comfort, but as a testament to patience, cooperation, and resilience. And as you settle closer to the fading hearth, wrapped in wool and shadow, listening to the wind circle the towers and the stone breathe softly around you, the night stretches onward, cold and unyielding, yet held at bay by the steady persistence of human warmth, waiting once more for the slow return of morning. As the last light fades from the sky and darkness folds around the castle like a heavy cloak, the world outside disappears into silence, broken only by the moan of wind circling the battlements and the soft rattle of wooden shutters straining against their hinges. Inside, the air is thick and still, the kind of cold that doesn't simply bite but lingers, the kind that seeps quietly into everything, from the iron handles on doors to the marrow of your bones. You begin to understand that surviving winter in such a place wasn't a matter of comfort, but of endurance, of clever adjustments and learned habits. Every choice was made with warmth in mind. The thickness of a wall, the placement of a bed, even which rooms people chose to inhabit, all were part of a quiet daily strategy against the slow advance of frost. Those who lived near the outer walls suffered most, for those stones, magnificent in battle, turned treacherous in peace. By midnight they radiated cold like an open grave. People learned to retreat inward, toward the core of the castle, where the warmth from kitchens, hearths, and clustered bodies could collect, forming faint zones of relief in a fortress otherwise ruled by chill. The upper towers were worst of all. Beautiful when viewed from below, but miserable to occupy once the wind began its endless whistling. Guards who kept watch up there stamped their feet to stay awake, their armor stiff with frost, and their torches sputtering as if even the flames wanted to escape. They moved constantly, pacing in small circles, not from restlessness but because stillness meant surrender. Down below, near the kitchens and servants' quarters, life felt more forgiving. The great ovens, still warm from baking, exhaled a soft heat that drifted into corners and lingered long after the last loaf had been pulled from the coals. Many of the lower servants preferred to sleep there, pressed close together on pallets of straw, the faint scent of bread and smoke clinging to the air. It was noisy, crowded, but almost cozy, a kind of makeshift refuge carved out of labor itself. Not all warmth came from fire. People created it with movement, with proximity, with shared presence. A noble woman might sit near her maid, not for conversation, but simply because two bodies together lose less heat than one. Even dogs were precious in this regard. Faithful companions by day, living blankets by night. Their fur carried a warmth that no textile could imitate. Smoke, too, played its strange role. It filled the upper air of the great hall, hanging in grey sheets beneath the rafters, trapping some of the heat that would otherwise vanish. To modern eyes it would seem unbearable, the constant sting of wood smoke, the haze of soot. Yet for them it was part of life, a small price for surviving the season. In its own way, smoke was insulation, a crude, accidental technology that softened winter's edge. For the wealthy, luxury meant not escaping the cold, but suffering it more gracefully. Thicker furs, more braziers, servants whose sole duty was to tend fires through the night. But even these comforts had limits. Once the flames died and the walls began to sigh, the cold returned all the same. It respected no rank, no banner, no seal of authority. And yet, within that harshness, something beautiful endured, a kind of togetherness born from shared hardship. The sound of logs crackling in the great hall, the whisper of voices telling stories beside the fire, the gentle breathing of those who finally drifted to sleep. These became the music of winter nights. Each ember, each sigh, a quiet act of defiance against the dark. So when you imagine those nights now, the flicker of torchlight on stone, the steady rhythm of dripping water, the faint warmth of fur against skin, it's easier to understand how they endured. They didn't conquer the cold. They coexisted with it. They learned to bend around it, to gather close, to let the small things, firelight, laughter, shared breath, become the difference between survival and surrender. As the days grew shorter and the nights stretched endlessly, winter became not a season but a way of life inside the castle. The rhythm of each day slowed until it seemed the entire fortress breathed in time with the fire, expanding when the flames rose, shrinking again when they faded to embers. People adjusted instinctively, knowing that warmth could never be taken for granted, that every moment of comfort had to be earned with effort, vigilance, and patience. The great hearth at the center of the hall was more than a place for cooking or ceremony. It was the heart of the castle itself, a living thing whose survival meant the survival of everyone. Servants guarded it like a shrine, feeding it with careful hands, coaxing the flames through the long hours of the night, and when a fire died too soon, the silence that followed felt almost frightening, as if the castle itself had stopped breathing. It took skill to build and tend such fires. The logs had to be chosen wisely, dried for months, arranged so that air could flow between them, and in regions where forests were scarce. This was no easy task. Some castles rationed wood as strictly as grain or salt, forcing families to share the limited warmth of a single fire between dozens of people. In those moments, heat became a kind of currency, traded through proximity. Whoever sat closer to the hearth was rich, and those in the shadows learned to make peace with the cold. The design of the hearth itself evolved slowly over centuries. In early medieval halls, smoke had nowhere to go but up, gathering thick beneath the beams until it crept out through holes cut into the roof. The air was dark and bitter, and yet people preferred it that way because the smoke insulated the upper parts of the room, trapping just enough heat near the ground to make the difference between life and frostbite. Later, chimneys appeared, tall, narrow flues carved through walls of stone, a marvel of invention that allowed fires to breathe and people to see across a room without their eyes watering. With chimneys came new possibilities. Smaller hearths could now be built in private chambers, allowing noble families to retreat from the smoky halls into quieter rooms that could finally be warmed on their own. Still, these fires were modest things, more symbolic than powerful. They warmed faces and fingers, but never the room entire. If you moved even a few steps away, the air turned cold again, as though the castle refused to let warmth linger too long in any one place. The smell of winter inside a castle was unlike anything in the modern world, a mixture of burning oak and damp wool, iron, ash, and the faint, mineral scent of stone that has been cold for centuries. You could taste it in the air, feel it in your skin, hear it in the way the fire hissed when the logs sweated moisture into the flames. Every sense was bound to the presence of cold, to its patience, its weight, its quiet insistence that nothing inside these walls truly belonged to the living alone. And yet, amid all this hardship, there was resilience, a quiet dignity in how people adapted. They invented routines not to defeat the cold, but to live beside it. Blankets were warmed by placing them over chairs near the fire before bed. Boots were stuffed with straw to keep out frost. Clay pots filled with embers were wrapped in cloth and slipped beneath covers before sleep. Even laughter had its role, because in those long dark evenings, it was the one sound that seemed to carry warmth of its own. In the deepest nights of January, when the frost outside sealed wells and silent streams, the castle still endured, a great creature of stone, breathing faintly through its fires and human hearts, holding against the cold with stubborn grace. Inside, people slept close together, trusting that the fire would last, that morning would come again, and that somehow, between the stone and the smoke, they would find just enough warmth to see them through another day. As winter deepened and the frost thickened upon the windows, life inside the castle became a study in contrasts. The warmth of human breath against the chill of stone, the flicker of firelight against the vastness of shadow, the hum of quiet activity within walls that seemed otherwise frozen in time. People moved more slowly, spoke more softly, and cherished the smallest comforts with a gratitude that feels almost unfamiliar to the modern world. Bathing in these months was rare, not out of choice but necessity. Water froze easily, and even when it was drawn fresh from the well, its chill could steal the air from a person's lungs. In most castles, a single room was reserved for washing, often near the kitchens where heat lingered, and a wooden tub would be filled with buckets carried by hand, steam rising in faint ribbons as servants poured the warmed water. The lord and lady bathed first, followed by their children, and finally the servants, the water cooling with each turn, its surface darkened by soot and soap made from ash and animal fat. The smell of it, a strange mix of herbs, smoke and iron, drifted faintly through the corridors. Because of the cold, bathing became a luxury, and cleanliness was maintained instead, through layers of linen changed often, brushed with dried lavender, thyme or rosemary to sweeten the scent. In this way, even hygiene became an active adaptation to the season. People learned not to fight the cold with grand gestures, but to coexist with it in small, careful ways, to warm their clothes by the fire before dressing, to wrap their hair and hands, to sleep with hoods drawn tight beneath the chin. Illness was an unwelcome visitor during these months, carried by the damp air that clung to the walls and seeped into lungs. Coughs echoed faintly down the corridors, and healers worked by the firelight, mixing remedies of honey, vinegar, and herbs, whispering prayers as they stirred their bowls. For all their efforts, the best cure for most ailments was simple warmth, the kind that came from being close to others, wrapped in blankets, with someone keeping watch through the night to feed the embers before they died. Yet even in such hardship, life did not lose its rhythm. The kitchen remained a place of constant motion, its air thick with the aroma of bread and broth. Meals were hearty and practical, salted meats, root vegetables, porridge, food designed not for pleasure, but to sustain. And as the light faded early each day, the castle gathered itself once more around the fire, the same way hearts gather around memory, seeking something that glows even when the world outside grows dark. It was in these moments that people rediscovered warmth, not only in flame but in fellowship. Stories were told in low voices, songs murmured half from habit and half from comfort. The kind of melodies meant less to entertain than to remind everyone they were still alive. A servant might share a tale from his village, a knight might hum an old marching tune, and a child might laugh at a shadow that flickered across the wall, all of it blending into the gentle heartbeat of winter life. And when special nights came, the midwinter feasts or the Feast of the Epiphany, the halls transformed, torches blazed brighter, banners unfurled, and even the cold seemed to retreat for a little while. Tables were set with whatever the season allowed, roasted meats, bread glazed with honey, jugs of ale steaming near the fire. For one night, perhaps two, the castle remembered joy. Music echoed off the stone, and the smell of spiced wine mingled with the sharp scent of pine brought in from the forest. Outside, the wind continued its lonely howl, but inside, laughter rose to meet it, as if daring the cold to come closer. By the time the embers began to fade and people drifted away to their chambers, the hall would be warm enough that you could walk barefoot for a few precious moments without flinching, and that feeling, fleeting, fragile, but real, was enough to remind everyone that warmth was not gone from the world. It was still there, flickering at the edge of endurance, waiting to be kindled again. By late winter, the castle had fallen into a kind of hush, the steady rhythm of survival settling over everyone like a second skin. The novelty of snow had long faded, replaced by the quiet persistence of frost that refused to melt, the kind that crept back every night even after a day of weak sunlight. The people within these walls had grown used to the sound of ice cracking in the courtyard, to the sigh of the wind as it slipped through arrow slits, to the way the great timbers of the roof groaned softly when the cold tightened its grip. Life had slowed to a whisper. The servants moved carefully now, conserving their strength, each step deliberate, each breath visible in the air. They carried wood and water in silence, their hands red from the chill, their movements rehearsed through repetition. No one complained, because complaint changed nothing. The cold did not bargain. Instead, they focused on small mercies. The warmth of a spoon left too long in a bowl of stew, the faint glow of embers that still pulsed beneath the ash when dawn came, the feel of wool pulled tight against the skin. The noble family spent most of their days near the hearth in the solar, the private upper chamber reserved for the lord and lady. Here the walls were lined with tapestries thick as cloaks, woven not just to display wealth, but to fight the draught that curled through every seam of the stone. The room smelled faintly of beeswax, of smoke, and of pine from the logs stacked nearby. The lady embroidered by the light of the fire, her fingers moving steadily despite the stiffness of the cold. The lord read by the window, wrapped in furs, his breath ghosting across the parchment, as though the words themselves might freeze if left too long untouched. Children huddled close to the fire, playing with small wooden figures carved by the household carpenter. Their laughter, soft, fleeting, and bright, was the warmest sound in the castle. Dogs lay sprawled beside them, their paws twitching in dream, their bodies radiating heat that everyone, even the adults, sometimes leaned near, just to feel the closeness of it all. The shared breath, the faint scent of smoke in every piece of fabric, became strangely comforting. Sometimes, when the cold grew too sharp, servants heated smooth stones in the fire and wrapped them in cloth to slip beneath the bed covers before sleep. The stones cooled quickly, but for a few moments they gave off a satisfying warmth that made the darkness feel gentler. Others filled clay pots with embers, carrying them carefully from the great hall to their sleeping quarters, glowing red dots of life moving through the shadows like wandering stars. These little rituals, almost sacred in their simplicity, were what kept the castle human. Outside, the world had gone still. The moat lay frozen, its surface smooth and ghostly beneath the moonlight. The trees beyond the walls stood bare, their branches brittle as glass. Even the animals had withdrawn into silence. The birds long gone, the foxes hiding in their dens. Only the wind remained constant, sometimes a whisper, sometimes a roar, circling the towers like an old spirit, testing the strength of the stones. And yet, despite all of it, there was something quietly magnificent in how the castle endured. It had been built to resist more than armies. It had been made to outlast time itself. Each winter was a trial, but each winter passed. The cold could gnaw, but it could not destroy. The same walls that chilled the blood also protected it. In that strange balance between punishment and protection, between stillness and survival, the people inside found meaning. And as the fire burned lower, crackling softly in the grate, someone, a servant perhaps, would rise to stir it once more, feeding the flames with another log. The orange light would flare again, painting faces in golden shadow, and for a moment warmth returned to every corner of the room. It was temporary, yes, everything in winter was, but in that flickering glow lay the quiet promise that the season would not last forever. By the time the last weeks of winter arrived, the castle seemed to exist in a half-dreaming state, not awake, not asleep, just waiting. The snow outside had hardened into layers of grey ice that glittered faintly beneath the moon, and every sound carried farther in the still air, the creak of a gate, the slow thud of hooves on frozen earth, the faint echo of voices wrapped in wool and distance. Inside, the fires burned lower now, their smoke curling lazily toward the rafters, their heat softer, more reluctant, like a tired heart beating just enough to keep life going. People had grown thin but steady, hardened by repetition. They no longer flinched at the cold touch of stone, or the sting of wind sneaking through a crack in the shutters. The body, it seemed, had learned its limits. The mind had followed. The castle's rhythms had become a kind of prayer. Wood to fire, fire to warmth, warmth to rest. Everything else could wait. Faith, too, had taken on a deeper texture in these final days of frost. The chapel, small and shadowed, smelled of wax and incense, its air heavy with the sigh of old prayers. Candles flickered along the altar, their flames reflected in the brass of the candlesticks, and people knelt close together, not only for devotion but for the quiet heat that gathered among them. The cold could not reach as easily here. And for an hour or two, hope felt tangible, glowing faintly in the space between breath and silence. Superstitions lingered in the corners like whispers, old beliefs that warmth might be coaxed from the walls if one spoke kindly to them, or that leaving bread and salt near the hearth would keep the fire spirits content. A servant might touch the doorframe before stepping into the courtyard, murmuring a charm against frostbite. A cook might hang an iron key above the kitchen fire to draw away the bitter air. These rituals, half prayer, half habit, gave meaning to endurance, small human gestures against a force too vast to fight. At night, the castle's corridors felt almost alive. The draught that wound through them hummed softly, a long, low tone that wove through every hallway. Sometimes, when you walked alone with only a candle in your hand, you could imagine that the wind carried voices, the echo of generations who had survived these same nights, who had stood before the same fires, whispering the same wish, "Let us last until spring." And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the change began. The air in the mornings no longer bit quite as sharply. Drops of water began to fall from the eaves, tapping softly against stone. The ravens grew restless, calling out from the battlements as if sensing something the people could not yet see. Inside, the fires were fed a little less. The rooms grew a little brighter, and when the sunlight finally reached through the arrow slits one afternoon, it caught the motes of dust in a golden dance that made the whole hall seem alive again. For the first time in months, the castle smelled not only of smoke, but of thawing earth. The cold retreated slowly, unwillingly, like a tide drawing back from shore, but it retreated all the same. People smiled more easily, spoke louder, lingered longer near open doors. And when a single green shoot appeared in the patch of frozen ground near the stables, it was enough to make the servants pause, to point, to whisper, "The winter has broken." The fires still burned at night, but now they were smaller, gentler, tended not with desperation but with quiet gratitude. The castle had endured, and so had the people within it. Stone, fire, and breath, all still in their places, all still alive, and as the first true warmth of spring crept through the old walls, the castle exhaled, as though it too had been holding its breath through the endless cold. By the time spring truly came, it did not arrive with fanfare or sudden warmth, but with small, patient signs that only the weary would notice. The sound of dripping water replaced the silence of ice. The first birds returned timidly, their songs echoing faintly through the courtyard. The ground, once hard as iron, began to soften beneath cautious footsteps, releasing the scent of earth that had slept for months beneath snow. And the castle, vast, grey, unyielding, began to change its voice. The same walls that had once trapped the cold now breathed with moisture, the stone darkening as the frost wept out of it. In the great hall the fires still burned, but the air above them shimmered differently now, lighter, freer, carrying a sense of something new. The servants opened shutters for the first time in weeks, letting sunlight fall across floors that had forgotten what colour was. Dust danced in the golden air like tiny spirits finally released. People moved differently too. The stiffness left their shoulders, their laughter returned in small, uncertain bursts. The children, who had spent the winter playing beside the hearth, ran out into the courtyard, splashing through the thin crusts of melting snow, their shouts bouncing off the stone and filling the castle with sound again. The dogs followed them, tails wagging, slipping on the wet cobbles. For the first time the air smelled faintly of grass and wood smoke rather than pure ash. The kitchen became a place of renewal as well. Herbs dried through the winter were replaced by the first fresh greens gathered from the thawing fields, wild garlic, sorrel, the pale beginnings of spring onions. The cooks worked with lighter hands, smiling as steam rose from new pots. The meals were still simple, still meant to nourish more than delight, but there was joy in them again, the joy of colour after months of grey. At night the fires were smaller, the rooms no longer heavy with the weight of survival. People sat further from the hearth now, leaving space for the cool air that drifted in through open doors. Even the sound of the wind had changed. It no longer howled, but murmured softly through the cracks, like a lullaby rather than a warning. The castle felt less like a fortress, more like a living thing shaking off a long sleep. In the chapel, candles burned slower, their flames steady instead of trembling. The prayers, too, changed in tone, not pleas for endurance, but thanks for mercy. The priest spoke of renewal, of God's patience mirrored in the thawing of the land, and as his voice filled the cold stone chamber, you could feel the echo of his words moving through the walls, as if even the stones themselves were listening. Outside, the river broke free from its frozen silence. The ice cracked with deep, booming notes that carried across the fields. The water ran black and swift again, curling around the base of the castle, carrying away the last fragments of winter, old leaves, stray bits of straw, soot from long-dead fires. The air smelled wet, clean, and alive. And in the quiet moments between chores, people simply stopped to feel it. The warmth on their faces, the slow return of colour to the world, the faint hum of life stirring beneath every surface. The castle, once an island of endurance in a frozen world, now stood as a monument to survival, to patience, to the simple truth that no winter, no matter how bitter, lasts forever. As night fell, the fires still crackled softly, but now they did so out of habit, not desperation. The glow they cast was gentle, golden, no longer a battle but a comfort. The walls, though scarred by centuries of frost, seemed almost kind in this new light, and if you stood there long enough, listening to the murmurs of people, the rustle of the wind through thawed branches, you could almost believe the castle itself was breathing again, quietly grateful for the warmth returning to its heart. As the days lengthened, the castle began to wake completely, like a great animal stretching after long hibernation. The snow that had once towered against the walls melted into silver rivulets, running down the stone and gathering in the moat, which rippled again under the pale spring sun. Where once there had been the sound of dripping water, now there was the hum of work, the scrape of tools, the laughter of stable boys, the rhythmic ring of a blacksmith's hammer echoing faintly from the courtyard. The cold had retreated at last, leaving behind a world remade. The gardens, long buried under frost, were the first to reclaim colour. Patches of green emerged hesitantly through the dark soil, then thickened into carpets of herbs and early flowers, violets, snowdrops, and the faint blush of primrose. The kitchen staff walked among them with baskets, gathering fresh shoots to flavour the season's first feasts. For months they had worked by firelight and stored provisions. Now they breathed in the scent of living earth, a reminder that the world could be kind again. In the great hall, tapestries that had hung like shields against the cold were rolled back to reveal windows newly opened to sunlight. The air no longer tasted of smoke but of rain and distant fields. The sound of the fire softened to a murmur, and people gathered there less for survival than for habit, as though still honouring the flame that had carried them through the darkness. They spoke of planting, of trade, of travel, words that had been too fragile to utter during the long winter. The children were the loudest heralds of spring. They ran barefoot through the courtyard, chasing chickens and each other, their laughter tumbling across the stones like birdsong. The dogs barked and spun. The stable horses flicked their tails at the flies that had returned with the warmth. Even the guards seemed lighter, leaning on their spears and smiling as they watched life fill the spaces that had been silent for too long. The festival of renewal came soon after, marked not by grandeur but by relief. The castle's chapel was draped in garlands of ivy and branches of budding hawthorn. Bells rang from the tower, echoing across the valley, and the people feasted together, lord and servant, child and elder, their faces bright in the glow of torches that burned for joy, not necessity. Wine flowed freely, and for the first time in months, no one spoke of cold or firewood or hunger. They sang until the stars came out, and when the music faded, they sat in the quiet, listening to the soft rustle of leaves outside the open doors. When night finally returned, it felt gentle, no longer heavy and suffocating. The moon shone on wet stone, on the slow curl of smoke from a few remaining hearths, on the faces of people finally unburdened by frost. Inside, the castle was warm, not from fire alone, but from life, from the weight of voices, laughter, footsteps, and the small heartbeat of peace that came with survival. And if you walk through its corridors now, you would no longer hear the sigh of the cold or the groan of shivering timbers. You would hear instead the faint creak of wood drying, the rustle of curtains stirred by wind, and somewhere, far above, the quiet call of a swallow building its nest beneath the eaves. The same stone walls that had once felt so merciless now seemed protective, almost tender in the sunlight. It was as though the castle itself had learned something from the long winter, that warmth was never permanent but always possible, that endurance like fire must be tended carefully, shared freely, and never taken for granted. And now, as the last chill of winter fades into memory, the castle stands serene beneath a pale blue sky, its towers silvered by morning light, its stones warm for the first time in months. The world beyond the walls has come alive again. The fields ripple with young grass, the river glitters like glass, and the forest hums with the sound of insects that have slept as long as men. Yet inside the castle the quiet remains, a softness left behind by the long cold months, as if the walls themselves remember how still the world can be when everyone listens. In the great hall the fire burns small and steady, not a desperate blaze but a humble companion, the way a heartbeat keeps rhythm after fear has passed. The same hearth that roared through the storm now glows with calm, the flames reflecting in eyes no longer weary but grateful. The tapestries stir faintly in the breeze from an open door, and sunlight drifts across the stone floor, catching the faint shimmer of dust that turns, lazily, like drifting snow. You can still smell the past in the air, the faint tang of wood smoke, the whisper of damp wool, the echo of laughter born beside the flames. The people of the castle move through their daily work again, but more slowly, as though unwilling to lose the peace that winter carved into them. They know that warmth is never owed, that it must always be tended in the hearth, in the heart, in the way one person draws close to another and shares breath. Outside, the hills are green again, the sky high and wide, and the air smells faintly of rain and renewal. The castle watches it all from its high perch, ancient and unblinking, a monument to endurance. It has survived the coldest nights, and so have those within it. They have learned what all who endure winter must learn, that warmth is not merely the absence of cold, but the presence of life. And when night comes once more, they light their fires not out of fear, but from gratitude, watching the flames twist gently upward, their glow soft against the walls that once exhaled frost. The wind sighs past the windows, harmless now like an old friend passing by. You sit near the fire, hearing its faint pop and whisper, and for a moment you can almost feel them, the centuries of souls who once sat here too, hands outstretched toward the same light, eyes half closed in the same quiet peace. The world beyond the stone may change, but this remains the hush, the warmth, the stillness of survival. Even after spring had softened the land and the trees outside began to whisper again, the memory of winter lingered in the castle like a ghost that refused to leave. The stone still held a faint coolness, and when you pressed your hand to the wall you could feel it there, not cruel, not biting, just ancient, a reminder of what had passed. The people who lived within those walls carried it too, in the way they tended the fires without thinking, or in the quiet pause they took before stepping outside into the morning light, half expecting to see their breath rise in front of them again. There was a rhythm to life after winter that felt almost sacred. The chores that once weighed heavy became acts of renewal, sweeping the soot from the hearth, scrubbing the wooden floors where melted snow had pooled, hanging fresh rushes and herbs to dry in the air. Everything that had endured the darkness now sought light. Windows that had been sealed against frost were opened at last, their wooden shutters creaking in protest, and the rooms filled with the scent of air and birdsong. In the great hall, the first evening without a fire felt strange, almost daring. The torches were left unlit, and the last light of sunset stretched across the long table, spilling over the grain of the wood like a river of gold. People lingered there longer than usual, unwilling to leave. Some spoke softly, others simply listened, to the distant murmur of the stream, to the wings of swallows darting through the open slits, to the stillness that for the first time no longer felt cold. The castle's heart had shifted. Where once the fire had been the only center of life, now warmth lived everywhere, in movement, in laughter, in the steady hum of days returning to order. The blacksmith's forge glowed again, this time with purpose, not survival. Farmers came and went through the gatehouse, their carts loaded with seed instead of firewood. Even the hounds, once curled tight against the chill, now sprawled lazily in the sun, their fur bright against the pale stone. But when night came, the people still built a fire, not because they feared the dark, but because fire had become part of who they were, a friend, a witness. The crackle of wood felt like an old song, and they could not bear to let silence take its place. They told stories again, of old winters, of ancestors, of how the frost had once climbed the castle walls like a living creature, and they laughed now because they had survived it. Sometimes, on the coldest nights of early spring, the wind would still turn sharp for a few hours, and the castle would remember. The torches would flicker, the stones would tighten, and someone would pull their cloak a little closer, half smiling, half shivering, as if to say, "We know you still exist, old winter, but we've learned to live with you." And in that quiet exchange, between cold and warmth, between memory and life, the medieval castle found its true peace. It was never meant to be comfortable, it was meant to endure, and within its endurance, it taught the people inside that survival could be beautiful too. By late spring, warmth had become something ordinary again, so gentle that most people no longer thought about it. And yet, on certain nights when the wind shifted, the castle seemed to recall its old silence, the one that had pressed so tightly against the walls during winter. It was in those hours when the fires burned low and the moonlight silvered the flagstones that the memory of the cold returned softly, not as fear, but as gratitude. The nights grew shorter, the air filled with the scent of damp earth and wildflowers, and the people began to speak of midsummer. In the valley below, villagers were already preparing for the great fires, the festivals that would mark the longest day. From the castle windows you could sometimes see them, faint pinpricks of orange light blooming on the dark horizon, a constellation of human joy scattered across the sleeping fields. The people of the castle watched them in silence, their faces faintly illuminated by both fire and moon, and something in their hearts stirred, a recognition that warmth, once so hard won, could also be celebrated. That night, the lord of the castle ordered the great hall opened wide. The doors that had been sealed against snow were thrown open to the night air, and the smell of blooming hawthorn drifted in like a blessing. The hearth was lit, though the air was already mild, and the flicker of the flames painted the tapestries in living gold. Servants carried in fresh bread, cheese, jugs of ale. Minstrels tuned their lutes and filled the stone vaults with sound that shimmered like sunlight. No one spoke of winter anymore, yet it was there, beneath their laughter, beneath the rhythm of the dance. It lived in the way people lingered near one another, how they poured drink for their neighbor before themselves, how they leaned just a little closer to the fire than they needed to. The cold had taught them not to take light for granted, and now, in this moment of abundance, they cherished it all the more. Outside, the courtyard was alive with the smell of rain and the rustle of trees. Torches burned along the walls, their smoke rising into the soft night sky. Somewhere a dog barked lazily. The stars above the towers gleamed clear and patient, the same stars that had watched the castle through every frozen season. They seemed to shine more kindly now. And when the music slowed, when the last song faded into quiet, no one hurried to leave. They simply sat, nobles and servants alike, letting the night wrap around them like a warm cloak. You could hear the river below, full and rushing again, and the faint rhythmic creak of ropes from the drawbridge swaying in the wind. It was in this peace, at the edge of summer, that the people of the castle finally understood what winter had given them. Not just survival, but the knowledge of how precious life could be when everything else is stripped away. The warmth they felt now was deeper, steadier, born not only from fire but from the shared endurance that had carried them through the dark. And as dawn approached, soft and rose-coloured, the last embers in the great hall glowed faintly on their own, a quiet echo of all the nights before, a reminder that even in the coldest places, light always waits to return. By midsummer the castle seemed to breathe with the land around it. The walls that had once gleamed with ice now shimmered with sunlight, their grey stone turning almost white beneath the long golden days. Vines crept lazily up the outer walls, softening their edges, and the hum of bees floated through the open windows. Even the air itself felt alive, warm and slow, heavy with the scent of hay and baking bread. People moved differently now. The stiffness that winter had carved into their bones had melted away, replaced by an easy, unhurried rhythm. The servants sang while they worked, their voices drifting up the stairwells. Children played in the courtyard until their laughter echoed all the way to the towers. The blacksmith's hammer no longer rang with the urgency of survival, but with the measured beat of craft, sparks scattering like fireflies in the daylight. The fires in the great hall were no longer needed, yet a small one still burned each night, not out of necessity but habit, a symbolic flame, as though the people could not bring themselves to let it die completely. They gathered there in the evening when the air cooled, sitting on benches polished smooth by centuries of use, drinking from wooden cups and telling quiet stories. The fire had become less a source of heat, and more a guardian, a companion marking the passage of time. Outside, the meadows stretched green and endless. The peasants in the fields below the castle worked in rhythm with the sun, and from the high windows you could see them move like tiny ripples of colour across the landscape. The lord sometimes rode down to speak with them, not out of duty but out of restlessness, his cloak light on his shoulders, his horse's hooves sending up clouds of dust. The air smelled of grass and horses and freedom. At midday, when the light poured through the arrow slits and turned the halls pale with brightness, the castle seemed almost weightless. The chill that had once haunted its corridors was gone. The tapestries stirred in the breeze, carrying with them the faint scent of lavender that hung from rafters to keep away insects. The stone, warmed by the sun, lost its cruelty. It held the day's heat and released it slowly after dusk, like a great hearth built by nature itself. And yet, even in the midst of warmth, people remembered. When they passed the hearth, they still reached out to touch the soot-darkened stones, remembering the months when that blackness had meant life. When they walked beneath the archway to the courtyard, they still looked up at the sky, half expecting snow instead of rain. Their gratitude was quiet but constant, stitched into every motion of daily life. At night, when the air cooled and the stars began to glitter above the towers, the castle filled with a different kind of music. The low hum of insects, the rustle of leaves, the murmur of distant water. Windows stood open, curtains swayed, and the people, lying beneath thin linen sheets instead of fur, listened to the sounds of summer as they drifted into sleep. The cold felt impossible now, like a dream they had once shared but could no longer quite remember. And yet, somewhere deep within the stones, the memory of winter waited, patient, ancient, certain that one day it would return. As the summer stretched on, its days grew softer, the sunlight less fierce, the evenings slower to fade. The fields below the castle ripened into shades of gold and rust, the air heavy with the scent of grain and distant rain. The people moved through their days with contentment, unaware that the season had begun its long, gentle descent towards something quieter. It started subtly, a breeze that felt cooler on the skin, a shadow that lingered a little longer across the courtyard, a faint sharpness in the air at dawn. The castle itself seemed to sense the change. The stone, which had basked in warmth for months, began to cool faster at night, holding the day's heat for shorter hours. The torches that had been left unlit through the summer were kindled again, not for warmth but for light, their flames fluttering in the dim halls as if stretching after sleep. Servants noticed that their breath began to fog again in the early morning when they carried water from the well. It wasn't cold yet, not truly, but it whispered of what was coming. Outside, the forests were beginning to turn. Leaves shimmered in the sunlight like coins, and when the wind passed through them, it sounded like the soft rustle of distant silk. The harvest filled the fields with color, deep amber, burnt red, the pale green of fading vines, and the scent of apples and smoke began to replace the sweetness of summer flowers. From the highest tower, you could look out and see the horizon shifting, the world preparing itself for rest. The people of the castle worked with new purpose now. Granaries were inspected. Wood was stacked high against the outer walls. Herbs were hung in bundles from the rafters to dry. The great hall, once open to the night, began to close itself again. Shutters were mended, gaps sealed, tapestries rehung. The first fires of autumn were lit in the evenings, not out of fear of cold, but out of respect for its memory. The smoke rose through the flue like an old friend returning home. There was beauty in this preparation, a kind of ritual grace. The women wove thicker cloth, their looms clicking softly in the corner of the hall. The men repaired tools dulled by summer's labor. Children helped gather kindling, their hands sticky with resin, their laughter echoing off the stone. Life once again began to turn inward, and when the first true autumn night arrived, when the air outside felt sharper and the stars above the battlements shone with a cold light, the castle felt smaller, closer, more human. The torches burned longer. The hearth glowed brighter. People found themselves drawn back to the fire, as if answering a quiet summons. They sat closer again, shoulder to shoulder, sharing warmth as they once had before, not because they were cold yet, but because they remembered what it meant to be. In that soft glow, surrounded by the scent of wood smoke and wool, the castle seemed timeless, suspended between seasons, between memory and the moment, aware that summer had given everything it could, and that winter, somewhere beyond the hills, was already stirring. By the time autumn took hold, the castle had changed its voice again. The hum of insects and laughter of summer gave way to the soft percussion of rain against stone, to the sigh of wind brushing through the courtyard, to the hollow echo of footsteps across floors that had grown cool once more. The sunlight no longer poured through the arrow slits, but drifted in cautiously, slanting and gold, like a visitor reluctant to stay. Everything in the air spoke of endings, though gently with grace. The forest surrounding the castle blazed with colour, deep crimson, ochre, amber, so bright it seemed to burn even without the sun. Leaves gathered in drifts against the walls, whispering whenever the wind passed. Smoke rose from every chimney again, thin at first, then stronger, carrying the smell of pine and peat. The people within the castle moved differently now, slower but more purposeful, their movements shaped by memory. They knew what lay ahead. The servants began their careful rituals, polishing the brass pots that would hold embers through the night, repairing wool cloaks that had been stored away, layering rushes on the floors to soften the sting of stone beneath their feet. The kitchens filled with the sounds of preparation, the rhythmic chop of knives, the clatter of wooden bowls, the hiss of boiling water. Apples were sliced and dried above the hearth, meat salted and hung in cool cellars, and the scent of spices, cinnamon, clove, and honeyed ale, wove through the corridors. In the great hall, fires burned higher once again, not yet in defiance of cold, but in greeting. The flames painted the walls with a moving light, glinting off the polished armor of guards and turning the woven hunts on the tapestries into living scenes. The dogs sprawled close to the hearth, and their fur gleamed in the orange glow. Outside, the rain fell steady, and its quiet drumming on the roof became a comfort, a reminder that the walls held, that the castle endured. Each evening, the household gathered closer. The air beyond the walls was sharp now, edged with frost. People wrapped themselves in heavier garments, wool and fur, drawing the warmth inwards. Old songs returned, the same melodies once sung to keep spirits high through snow and darkness. A minstrel might pluck his lute near the fire, while a child drifted to sleep on a bench beside him. the crackle of logs keeping rhythm with the soft tune. Faith wove itself into these evenings, quiet and unspoken. The chapel lamps burned longer, their light golden against the chill. The priest's voice echoed faintly through the corridors as he offered blessings for health and for the patience to face another season of hardship. And the people listened, not with fear but with calm acceptance, for they understood now that winter was not the enemy, only a guest that demanded respect. Sometimes, when the rain paused and the night turned clear, you could see the breath of the world rise like smoke above the moat, and the stars reflected there looked like scattered embers. The castle seemed to float in its own light, a single warm heart beating in a valley of darkness. It was beautiful, but also humbling, a reminder that even stone could feel small beneath the sky. And as the first true frost crept over the fields, turning the grass pale and brittle, the fires inside burned brighter. People spoke less and listened more, to the pop of the logs, to the wind finding its way through the battlements, to the quiet sigh of the earth preparing for sleep. The warmth was still there, steady, living, fragile, as it had always been. The first snow came without warning. One evening the air outside was only cool and still, the fields resting under a pale moon. By morning the world had changed. The courtyard lay hushed beneath a thin white veil. The trees bowed slightly under the weight of frost, and every sound seemed muffled as though the sky itself was listening. From the highest tower the landscape looked endless and pure, stretching outward in silent light, and for a moment even the castle appeared to hold its breath. Inside, the cold had returned, not yet fierce but certain, a familiar visitor crossing the threshold once more. The servants rose before dawn to light the fires, their breath fogging in the dim corridors. Sparks leapt eagerly to life, catching on dry twigs, and soon the smell of smoke wound its way through the hallways like a herald of memory. It had begun again, the season of closeness, of patience, of endurance. The first snow always carried a strange beauty. Children ran into the courtyard to leave footprints that vanished within minutes. Dogs barked and chased flakes that disappeared before they could be caught. Even the lord and lady paused by the window to watch the storm build, not with dread this time, but with a kind of solemn wonder. They had lived through this once before, and they knew what it asked of them. Throughout the day the snow thickened, drifting against the walls, softening the harsh lines of battlements and towers. The drawbridge creaked beneath its growing weight. Somewhere above, an icicle began to form, catching the faint light like crystal. The castle, so loud in summer, fell quiet again, its sounds returning to whispers, the soft thud of boots, the distant crackle of firewood, the slow rhythmic hum of life, adjusting to the cold. By evening the great hall glowed once more with the light of many fires. Shadows danced across the walls and the air shimmered with heat and smoke. People gathered around the hearth as they had months ago, settling into the same seats, the same silences, the same simple peace. The faces were older now, the memories deeper, but the warmth felt the same. The circle had closed. The priest passed through the hall before supper, marking the threshold with a cross of ash, murmuring blessings for protection through the long months ahead. The scent of burning pine filled the air. Outside, the wind began to sing along the parapets, not cruelly but insistently, like a reminder that nothing in this world lasts forever. Yet inside the walls, there was only calm. The servants moved easily, knowing every draught and every door that needed sealing. The children, now a little taller, curled again beside the fire with the dogs, tracing patterns in the frost that gathered along the window glass. The hearth had become once more the heart of all things, and when night finally fell, thick and deep and heavy with snow, the castle did not resist it. The fires burned steady, the voices faded one by one, and the walls, for all their chill, seemed almost kind in the flicker of the last flame. Outside, the world lay still. Inside, warmth and life endured, fragile, patient, eternal. By midwinter, the world outside the castle had fallen utterly silent. The snow no longer drifted. It pressed down heavy and endless, blanketing the fields and forests, until every familiar shape was swallowed by white. The air itself seemed frozen, so still that even sound refused to travel. From the high windows you could see nothing but the faint shimmer of ice beneath a colourless sky, and the faint columns of smoke rising from distant cottages, small signals of other fires, other hearts enduring the same cold. Inside, the castle moved more slowly than ever. The days had lost their boundaries. Morning and evening blurred into a single pale light that filled the rooms like breath on glass. Servants moved quietly through the halls, wrapped in wool and patience. The kitchens glowed with orange light, the one place where life still burned fiercely, the smell of roasting roots and wood smoke mingling with the faint sweetness of baked bread. Everything revolved around the fire, its crackle, its scent, its pulse. The great hall was quieter now than in any other season. People spoke softly, as if the walls might echo too loudly in the stillness. The dogs dozed close to the hearth, their ears twitching at the faint pop of sap in the burning logs. Children, restless from long confinement, whispered games to one another, tracing patterns in the dust where sunlight had once fallen. The adults sat further back, eyes half closed, thinking of spring but speaking of nothing. The nights were long, impossibly long, and yet they had their own kind of peace. Outside, the wind prowled along the battlements, dragging fine snow through every crack it could find, but it was a familiar sound now, a lullaby rather than a threat. Within the thick walls, the castle felt almost alive, breathing slowly through its chimneys, dreaming through the cold. The flames cast their steady dance upon the stone, and that flickering gold light became a world of its own. Each morning began the same way, the soft scraping of boots on flagstone, the hollow thud of logs stacked by the hearth, the sigh of bellows feeding new life into the embers. The fire always survived the night, barely, sometimes only a handful of coals hidden under ash. But it survived, and when the first sparks caught and flared, when the warmth began to creep outward once more, the entire castle seemed to exhale. Sometimes a messenger would arrive from a nearby manor, his cloak rimmed with frost, his horse steaming in the courtyard. He would bring news of other villages, of frozen rivers, of hunters who'd gone too far into the woods and not returned. Yet even those stories carried no panic, only the slow understanding that winter took what it wished. People had learned not to fight it, but to wait, to trust that time would move again when it was ready. In the chapel the candles burned brighter now, their light pooling against the cold. The priest's voice rose and fell gently, as he spoke of endurance, of the seasons turning in their appointed hour, of warmth promised to the patient. His breath smoked in the air like incense, and when the last hymn ended, no one hurried to leave. They lingered in the faint glow, letting the silence settle over them like a blessing. Outside, the moon rose early and lingered late, pale and enormous above the whitened earth. Its light spilled across the snow, catching on the frozen battlements, turning every icicle into silver. The castle shone faintly under that cold light, a single heartbeat of warmth inside a world made of ice. And deep within its walls, by the same fire that had burned through every season before, people gathered again, closer this time, wordless, content just to feel the heat, and to hear the soft sound of the wind beyond. And then, one morning, the cold began to break. No one saw it happen, not at first. It came quietly, not with warmth, but with sound. Somewhere in the courtyard, water began to drip from the eaves, slow and rhythmic, like the ticking of a clock returning to life. The ice on the window panes softened at the edges. The air, though still sharp, carried a scent that hadn't been there for months, the faint, impossible smell of thawing earth. People noticed in silence. Servants paused at their work, listening. The cook stood by the kitchen door, squinting at the weak sunlight pushing through the clouds. Even the dogs seemed to sense it, lifting their heads and sniffing at the air as if they recognized an old friend. Inside the great hall, the fire burned as it always had, but it no longer felt like the center of the world. It was still precious, still alive, but its power was beginning to fade into gentleness. Outside, The snow melted into narrow streams that ran between the stones, trickling down into the moat and vanishing beneath the drawbridge. The ravens called from the towers again, their voices rough but hopeful. The land had not died. It had only been sleeping. For days the change was slow, almost shy. A patch of mud here, a hint of green there, but soon it was undeniable. The sun climbed higher, the air began to move again. Curtains stirred where they had hung still for months, and dust lifted in the golden light. The castle, so long heavy with silence, began to hum. Boots struck the floors with confidence again. Laughter echoed up the staircases, and the sound of life returned to every chamber. The people gathered one last night around the hearth, not out of need, but out of gratitude. They didn't speak of the winter they had endured. There were no grand words, no toasts, only the quiet understanding that they had faced the cold and kept their flame alive. The Lord leaned back in his chair, his eyes half closed in the glow of the fire. The lady reached out to rest her hand on his. The children slept where they sat, their heads resting against the fur of the dogs. When the final log crumbled into embers, no one stirred to feed it. The warmth had done its work. The castle no longer needed the fire to feel alive. Outside, the night was soft and dark and full of sound. Dripping water, rustling trees, a distant owl calling across the valley. The wind, once cruel, had turned tender, brushing past the towers like a lullaby. And as the dawn crept over the hills, pale and gold, the first birds sang. The castle, after its long and frozen sleep, breathed deeply once more. The stones glowed faintly in the light, and from within their ancient heart came the quiet rhythm of life. Steady, human, eternal. Because warmth, as those who lived there had learned, was never just a thing of fire. It was the pulse of endurance, the memory of shared breath, the promise that even after the longest winter, spring would always find its way home.